Welcome to The Law Matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. This program has been created to educate, inform, and help you with the law matters because the law matters. Understand the law better, and you're in a better position to decide how to protect yourself, your family, and your business. We continue to provide information and resources that'll help you decide whether or not you need or want to contact a lawyer. Perhaps we'll help you determine whether you may want to handle some issues yourself. If you do need professional counsel, you'll be better prepared, and as a result, so will those you select. Either way, you'll be saving time, money, and hopefully achieve better results. The Bazar and Associates law firm in East Providence continue to help us tackle various issues, and we want to welcome and thank David Bazar.
Thank you.
Okay, counselor, so today we're going to talk about the challenges and the proposed solutions to prevent the countless and tragic deaths, injuries, and incidences that happen within the child welfare system. Children at risk, it's a topic that happens and occurs nationally and too often, of course. Regarding child abuse and neglect, our local headlines read, and I quote, "Scathing report calls for overhaul of Rhode Island's child welfare services." That's our state, it's Massachusetts, it's across the country. So calls for drastic reforms abound. Today we need to attack some of those issues. So David, let's start with your frame of reference relative to the child welfare system.
So in my practice, part of my practice is involved in family court with DCYF cases in Rhode Island. And I'm familiar, therefore, with both the judicial process as it's involved with these cases, and I'm also familiar with the things that take place outside of the courthouse with DCYF and other social agencies that are involved with children and a lot of the issues that go on with children.
And just for a point of very recent information, we in Rhode Island have a new child welfare advocate, and you were among some of those who were reviewing.
I was fortunate enough to be on the search committee to make a recommendation to the governor of 3 people for the governor to select the person she most was comfortable with in that position. And we gave 3 really good options to the governor, and she selected an excellent choice.
And briefly, theoretically, what does the child advocate's office take care of?
So in Rhode Island, that position was created for there to be somebody, a watchdog, so to speak, to oversee all the things that are going on in the state to protect children. So she, in this case, she has the ability to oversee what happens at DCYF, to investigate things that happen or don't happen with children who are in the care of DCYF, to go out and investigate and be familiar with all of the other agencies that are providing services to children in Rhode Island, and also to weigh in court, both in cases that she may bring against DCYF, the state, or other people if she feels it's necessary, or to weigh in on individual cases where she deems it important and where there's a conflict with other attorneys who might not be able to otherwise weigh in.
And most other states have some sort of office of advocacy or a child welfare advocate to serve as an intermediary as well. Very recently, Rhode Island had been called on the carpet, so to speak, for having systemic issues with the DCF or DCYF, and yet, as I did some research, that happens elsewhere.
It happens in many, many systems, and it's very difficult because every child's unique, every situation can be different, and you can't always fit these kinds of cases into cookie-cutter solutions, number one. And on a much more global and broader perspective, the system doesn't always operate the way it should. And it's interesting because you started the introduction to the question with DCF and then corrected it to DCYF, but it just shows you how far back these issues go.
Yes.
Because at one point in time, the system in Rhode Island was DCF. And there was supposed to be a massive overhaul to protect and put children in a much better position and change the system, and DCF became DCYF. And today, a lot of the same issues, some different, but a lot of issues are still presented.
Of course, when we read these very negative headlines, somewhere the issue about the caseworkers, the social workers, we understand that they play a critical role in the system, nationwide that is, and they're supposed to protect the overall well-being. You point out some of the challenges, and of course with families being challenged themselves. They're too few, they're stretched, and they're trying to work within a system that's challenging them too with some of their behaviors, obviously. There's so many tragedies and only so many social workers. How do they manage to have enough social workers to do what needs to be done, days, nights, weekends, for so many people? 702,000 in 2014. It's difficult to tackle.
There's a lot of different layers of protection and involvement that children can have with the state. One of the first layers of protection, and you will often hear this, is when there's something that happens to a child and somebody is either a mandatory reporter, and we've seen a little bit of things in the news about mandatory reporters and somebody being charged with a crime for not reporting an abuse to a child. It was at I think a school system in Cranston or something like that. But in any event, so there's either a report or a mandatory report that goes, could be the child hotline, and there's a call that's made, and then there's an investigator from DCYF who goes out and investigates. Those people do a really good job oftentimes of getting out in the field and seeing what's going on, laying eyes on the situation where necessary, taking a child and protecting the child until they get to court the next day or whatever to make some kind of court order to see what should happen with that child. And then the child gets into the system. If the parents are charged with abuse or neglect or whatever, that brings the case in front of a judge in a DCYF case. Then the parents become involved and represented either by a public defender or attorneys or in a court-appointed attorney. The child is represented by a guardian ad litem and a CASA worker. And the state, DCYF, is represented by an attorney who works for the state through DCYF. And so everybody's got some voice, and the judge gets to hear from a lot of different people. The other person who's involved in that case, as you're talking about, is the social worker from DCYF, who now is sort of in charge of putting something in place, a plan for that family and how we're going to protect that child. But also, the goal in any DCYF case is reunification of the parents with the children.
And that in of itself is a topic. But when you look at the number of children who are in the system and the amount of social workers that are around and the number of hours, and we read nationally that there are far too many kids for the number of social workers. And while, as I've been investigating here, some of them may not be well enough educated or may not have all of the tools environmentally and technologically in place, still that is a stressed system because there are so many to take care of.
It's a stress system in a stressful situation. Absolutely is. And so I didn't directly answer the question before, so I'll do it this time. Yes, they are stretched. And I have seen some really, really good social workers, really good people who have had difficulty doing everything that they want to do for a particular child in a particular case because they are being pulled in many directions because of all of the responsibilities and cases that they have. I will tell you, though, that they generally do a good job in that situation. Unfortunately, there are some social workers who aren't quite as attuned to the needs of the family or the child, who draw some conclusions early on in a case and who don't really do a good job. And I'm afraid to say that in those rare instances, and I will tell you that I do believe that that is the rare case, but it's very, very upsetting because what it can do to that family that should be being reunited and what has actually happened. Again, very rare, but the bigger problem, as you say, is so many cases for so few workers, and even the really great ones can get distracted or pulled away from what needs to be done. But overall, if you said to me, would I rather have that great worker and give them too many cases, or one of the few that aren't so good and just have a handful, I'm going to say stress out the very busy person because that's who I want my case with.
Point well taken. The child welfare advocate, from the time she arrived at the desk in our state alone, there were, until now, there have been numerous 7-month-old infants dead near dead, 18 months old. I can't recall, 4 or 5 or 6 of them. And in many of these cases, the point was made was that the child was not, quote unquote, in state care or custody at the time. However, that child had been part of the system, so to speak, part of the DCF system. I don't imagine that the case had been closed. It was involved and still open. Again, here's another example where your DCF is being charged with the problem, except that they're not doing daily diligence here. They're just part of the casework.
Right. So the child advocate is looking at a situation where she may see some systematic failures or systemic problems. And that's her job. She's supposed to be global, look at the big picture and say, there are problems. And then it's incumbent on her to do what she's doing, which is to bring the players to the table and get them to look at the problems and come up with a solution. As you said, some of these cases involve people who were involved in the system, but the child was not in state care or custody. Doesn't matter. Once the child's involved in the system, we as a society owe an obligation to do whatever we can to make sure that that child is protected. You can't protect every child against everything, either as a parent or as a DCYF or a system. Cases don't get to the system. Children die in parents' care either through fault of the parent or not through no fault of the parent. And it's always been a difficulty to say, I want to protect every child from everything. You can't do that. But you need to put in place the best system that you can have that gives every child the best opportunity.
And I think it's kind of important to point out that while we talk about maybe a shortage of good, social workers in the system, in other states where they have far more money available, including even in New York, they talk about a $100 million investment just last year. They talk about the system being better, but the system itself is still broken. So this isn't just a situation where are the funds, and that would, if you apply funds, it would certainly fix it. Apparently not.
Right.
Now we started to talk about the child abuse and neglect, but also there are so many other things that put a child into the system. A couple of them, and please if you can elaborate on them. You have a child that is involved with drugs, or maybe the parent that's involved with drugs. That, I guess, is neglect and abuse. But if a child has problems with truancy or misbehaving, they end up being part of the system as well.
Right, different system in the sense that that's considered a juvenile case. And now juvenile cases are cases that would either amount to a crime or misdemeanor or felony that is committed by the child. Now, it's interesting because, again, this system, I have cases in that too, is a little bit different. Again, the parents can be represented, but the child is represented by either an attorney or a public defender because it's the child's rights that are at risk and that are in issue. The state in that kind of case is represented by the Attorney General's office because that's who brings the charges that are being brought against the child. The town or the city or town initially does bring those charges, but if it's a felony, the AG's office is involved. And so you go into family court. Now, in Rhode Island, the family court has developed a system to try to pull out those cases that aren't as serious and might be a one-timer event or a one-off or something just didn't go right, and to talk to the child, sort of like an early intervention, and keep that case out of the family court system. It's called the intake center or intake cases. And those cases are heard by an intake supervisor who looks at the case and then will make a recommendation. Okay, you talked about alcohol use maybe or drug use. So what they might suggest is we're going to have you get some counseling, and we're going to have you take some screens perhaps, and we're going to have you do some other work, maybe community service or some other things, and make sure that whatever the problem is resolved before it becomes more serious. If it's more serious and it goes through the juvenile system, the point of the juvenile system is not to punish the child. That's why there are no jury trials in juvenile court, because we're saying we're not taking someone's liberty away to punish them, it's to rehabilitate them. So if all people in the system have their eye on the ball, they should be looking at what is it that we can do for this child to rehabilitate the child so that when the child becomes an adult, these things don't keep repeating themselves. And it's interesting, in the end of April, beginning of May, there's a day called Law Day. And the judges in the Bar Association has attorneys that go out to schools, and we talk on different topics. And one year it was on constitutional rights, and we're at a school in Providence, and I was with one of the judges from the family court, it was an inner city school, and a lot of the people, the students in the school, knew of the judge because a lot of their friends, if not them, had been in front of her before. And at the end of that day, I said, does anyone have any questions for the judge? And one little girl raised her hand and she says, Judge, I just got to ask you one thing. You have someone who comes in who has a drug problem, perhaps, and you send that girl, my friend, to different places for rehab. She goes through all the systems. She does this and she does that. And then what do you do with her at the end of that? You return her to her family. Same place where the same issues were, with the same friends, with the same set of problems. Do you think you really solved the problem? And the judge thought about it long and hard, and she says, you raised a really good issue. Perhaps some of what we should be doing isn't centered just around that child, but around the family and around the whole situation. And that's more of a global way of looking at some of these problems.
And you pointed out earlier that of almost all cases, the goal is to keep a family together, and if they have been taken from the family, to get them back with the family if that's possible. And of course, there's an issue too about when and if they should actually do that. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's not. But when there's a first offense, whether the parents caused it because of their own bad behavior or the child's, I assume that there is at least enough in place theoretically that can counsel them and keep them in place in the family, rather than sending them out to what had been known as, once upon a time, night-to-night placements and just extricating them from the home.
Right.
That's not the plan.
Right. Two different issues. So on the juvenile side, generally speaking, depending on what the crime, the situation in the home is, that's usually what happens. We keep them with the parents with certain requirements. It could be as simple as you have to obey your parents' lawful commands, listen to your parents. There might be a curfew. There could be things like that. It could be even home confinement, where there's an ankle bracelet and you can only go to school, a doctor's appointment, back home, and there's some strict monitoring in that situation, as opposed to the situation in the DCYF cases where it's the parents oftentimes that are the problem or the issue. And what do we need to do to protect the child? Placement somewhere else. Of course, the change in night to night and all of that has been relative placement. Can we place the child with a relative so that that's the person who has the child with them, rather than some stranger or some home somewhere or some other facility? So yes, the answer is we try to keep either with the home or a family member.
Or the relative.
Right.
And of course, even now, these days, that ends up posing some potential problems. So there's no one answer to these things. When you have an occasion to have cases yourself these days, is it more of a situation where you're working with the parent side, or?
Well, it depends what kind of case.
With DCYF issues
yeah.
specifically.
Right. So with DCYF, in my office, we generally would be the ones representing the parent. The person who's representing the child, so to speak, is appointed by the court. Through the court, it's an employee of a system, court-appointed special advocate, CASA system, where there's a CASA attorney and the CASA worker, perhaps, who goes out and sees the child as well. And then, of course, the attorneys that represent the state, DCYF, in that type of case.
And go ahead.
In the juvenile cases, my office usually would be defending the juvenile.
So you had mentioned earlier on, and I wanted to go back for our viewers, explain who or what an ad litem is.
Guardian ad litem. So a guardian ad litem is someone who's appointed to represent somebody's interests that they can't represent themselves. So if it's a child generally can't represent themselves, so a guardian ad litem is appointed for that purpose. In family court domestic cases, for example, where a child's placement is an issue, or custody is an issue, or visitation, a guardian ad litem will be appointed to go and talk to the child and figure out what is in that child's best interest from the child's perspective. It's not always what's in the best interest from or what the mother wants or the father wants. And I was talking to someone recently about relocation cases, which are when a mom or a dad who, let's say they both lived in Rhode Island at the time of the divorce and one of them wants to move to another city or town for a certain reason. The lawyers may not know exactly what that reason is, or, well, the lawyers would find out. The guardian ad litem might not find that out. The guardian's just talking to the child about what's going on with the child's interest, but the lawyers may find out through discovery that the mom, let's say, is saying she's moving for a new job, but really it's not, it's something else. That's up to the lawyers to figure out. The guardian may figure that out, but the guardian's role is really to talk to the child and figure out what's in the child's best interest.
Which would bring up the point that, in fact, there is such a thing as the Children's Bill of Rights.
Right.
And the guardian ad litem is supposed to be helpful with that.
That's correct. So what we're talking about generally is protecting the rights of a child in different situations. And that is pretty much what a guardian's role is.
And when it comes to those of us who may be witnesses to something that's not okay, the reporting factor,
right,
whether it's at school or at your neighbor's house, what's the law?
So if you are in a situation where you're working at a school, if you work at a hospital, so you're a medical provider, you're a teacher, you're an administrator of a school, a doctor, those types of things. If something comes to your attention that raises a serious suspicion of abuse or neglect, then you are a mandatory reporter, meaning you are under law to contact DCYF and let them know that there are concerns. If you're a next door neighbor and you have concerns, you don't have to report those, but if they're legitimate, real concerns, you should report those.
To whom? To
DCYF.
The police?
Well, there's a hotline. There's a DCYF hotline. You can call the police. That's always an option. The police will tell you to call the hotline.
And I raise that because apparently there were some questions about who should you call, who do you need to call? And in fact, there was a question about, do I need to have proof before I call? Or is it just a matter of my judgment call if I am very suspicious or very concerned about whatever I'm seeing?
If you have a legitimate, logical suspicion, then you probably should call. If you're just being nosy and don't really know anything and just something doesn't seem right to you, but you have no reason logically to think that, then you're probably just being nosy. But the important thing is, if you have a reason to suspect that there's a problem, then you really should call.
And let's talk a little bit about the importance of foster parents and also the recent concerns with them. We understand that there is a screening process before you are given the entrusted to a child 2 or 3. You're also typically paid for it, and that makes perfect sense.
Right.
And you should theoretically be involved with that for the right reasons, not just for the cash.
Correct. So if you're a foster parent, you are paid some money to care for that child. Theoretically, the money is to care for the child. That's the only reason you should be doing those kind of cases, is because you have legitimate heart for a child and children and want to make sure that there's a place for them to go to be safe and be cared for and be loved, and all of the right reasons to have a child in your home. DCYF has an obligation to, as you say, license and inspect and re-inspect what's going on in the home. Oftentimes that's one of the areas where we see some gaps in them falling down a little bit on what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to know everyone who's in the home. They're supposed to do background checks. They're supposed to make sure it's a safe place for the child. Many, many years ago, my office had a case that I wasn't directly involved in, but it went to federal court, and it was because DCYF allowed 2 young children to be in a home with another person who was in the home, only known to even DCYF as quote-unquote thin man. And this fellow was sort of torturing these children, hitting them with belts, tying them up, putting them in the basement. He wasn't the foster parent. He was just someone in the home. And DCYF claimed, well, we didn't know he was in the home, even though their records showed, oh, the only person who was home when I went in to check was Thin Man. Not even a name, Thin Man. That's how they were known to DCYF and known to others. So that's DCYF's obligation, to make sure that beyond just the foster parents, who is in the home and what is going on in that home, and to make regular and surprise inspections.
And yet, personally, on the other side of it, I can tell you I had been involved in trying to help recruit foster parents for the teenagers, which is also a little bit of a struggle. But we were thwarted by the fact that the system took so long to vet, and it confounded the families and said, we're just not going to put up with it.
Right.
The other side of that is you need that kind of thoroughness to make sure that there's a safe environment and they've crossed the T's and dotted the I's.
You can do both.
You can.
You can vet thoroughly and quickly, and the thoroughly would be the background checks, any other information that you can get that's relevant, knowing who's in the home and who's not in the home. And I'm sure one state agency can get all the information they need from the other state agency quickly to get all of that information. And if they can't, then something should be done to fix that. So it should be done quickly, because as you say, the more good people who are willing to do these things that are online, the better off we all are. And then after it's done, it should be followed up on.
Of course, we always have a shortage of foster families, and that's national from what I understand. And of course now, as a political commentary, that may be exacerbated by the fact that you may have some detention and deportation, which will put some families, will cause more schisms and more need for foster parents.
Right.
When children find that there's something wrong, they may not know who to go to. School might be their first line of defense. Does that then put the school in a bad situation? What happens with that, David?
It can put the school in an interesting and maybe somewhat difficult dilemma, because if it's not a major issue, then the school person has to decide, wait, does this rise to the level as a mandatory reporter that I have to do something, or is it something not so high up but needs some attention that we can counsel and help with? But that's where the child normally would go, and probably where the child should go if there's somebody there that they feel safe and comfortable to talk to. Oftentimes a school will have a resource officer from the police department, and maybe the school can turn to the resource officer as well and say, here's what we've got, what do you think? Depending on what the issue is, maybe the officer would go and talk to someone in the family or deal with it that way.
Good to know. We have to address the issue with children as well. So thank you so very much for tuning into The Law Matters. We hope that this has shed some light on a very important topic, and we hope you will continue to tune into The Law Matters, because the law matters to you.